About the Vikings. I pretty much covered the Vikings, but again, just so you see the areas where all the Vikings went. The Vikings did not have helmets with two horns on them, unlike the Minnesota Viking football team. So that did not happen. And so the Vikings settled throughout all these places. They have a lot of influence on the development, cultural development, linguistic development to some extent. And obviously, they intermarry and breed with the people there and things like that. So let's talk about this next group here, the Magyars. See this green lines? The Magyars come out of Eastern Europe and start moving into all throughout the European peninsula continent here. And this becomes a big issue fighting the various Germanic groups. The Magyars end up settling basically in this area, okay? And the Magyars are the people that are forerunners to the Hungarian peoples, okay? But this is a big deal during this time, so I will say a little bit about that. So the Magyar tribes invade from the east, as I showed you there. And if you also look back at the map, you'll see the Muslims attack Italy and Spain from the south. So if you go back to here, you see all these little red lines. So Muslims did attack all these areas and actually settled in a number of these islands. So there were Muslim settlements in Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, southern Italy, Balearic Islands, and actually in southern France here too. They actually sacked Rome during this period in 846, as you see there. Now, they don't take over all these areas over a long period of time, but that did happen during this period, okay? So, part of the reason why feudalism develops is because of these events. People are looking for a new order, or maybe order is too strong a word, but a new way to deal with these challenges. Well, I call this the restoration of order, but it took a while. But there are some important beginnings here. In the French nobles elected Hugh Capet as king in 987. Remember, we don't vote for kings. Well, actually, you do sometimes. Often, nobility did vote for kings from among themselves, and even if kings were part of a hereditary dynasty, meaning, if someone's son became king, he had to be approved by nobles often too, and same with queens in other cases. In England, what becomes England, the King Alfred, who was from the area of Wessex. Wessex is West Saxon area. Resist Vikings. So Danes here would have been Viking groups from Denmark. He unites Anglo-Saxon tribes, and in many ways, he's the founder of what becomes Anglo-Saxon kingdom that we know as England later. In Central Europe, you have the rise of Otto I, who was the ruler of the German-speaking areas in Central Europe. He, like Hugh Capet, was chosen by the Germanic-speaking and German-speaking nobles. What makes Otto very significant is he fought those Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld and beat them. Okay? He wins the Battle of Lechfeld and he becomes very powerful. Otto will become the most powerful king in Europe since Charlemagne, and he's rewarded with the same thing that Charlemagne was. He, like Charlemagne, was crowned emperor by the Pope. And you really have the beginnings of what becomes the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation during this period. Some people trace it back to Charlemagne, but in reality, this is where it really begins. Because it was really mostly a German-speaking kingdom, and these German kings were often crowned as emperors. And they had a lot of power, so they played a significant role. This purple area is the area of Otto's empire. Now later he moves, he comes down to Rome and he's crowned king of the He's crowned a Roman emperor, right? Emperor of the Romans. Notice also, see, these areas were controlled by Muslims at the time. That's another reason why the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and others wanted a strong Germanic king down here to help them. Okay? Also, notice the Byzantines still had territory in southern Italy here. So, let's switch to looking at Italy in the 11th century and important events. So, you see, notice this blue area called the Patrimony of St. Peter, or we often refer to as the Papal States also. Also, notice Italy was not one united kingdom during this period. It had a bunch of different kingdoms and duchies and so forth. And notice in the south, you still had, in these pink areas, areas ruled by the Byzantine emperors. Now, these areas, eventually in the 11th century, the Muslims lose control over them. So that's another thing to remember. So let's look at what's happening at this time. And we have to look at something that scholars call the Papal Reform Movement. Papal Reform Movement is a very big topic. These reformer groups within the Christian church in Western Europe wanted to change some things in society. And there were three main issues that I talk about right here. There were more, but these were kind of three big issues, social issues, we might say today. One, they were very concerned about stopping the violence among knights and fighters in society. So this kind of goes along with the development of feudalism and the development of what we call chivalry. Okay, so that was one thing they were very concerned about. And they started these movements called the Peace of God movements, in which they tried to get knights to swear that they would not attack innocent people, they would not attack women and children, they would not attack unarmed, what we would think today is unarmed civilians and things like that. Or the church, for that matter, which was a big deal to them, right? Two, they wanted to end the practice of simony. Simony is the practice of buying and selling church offices. So simony was considered bribery. It was a sin where, because church offices could be very powerful, like being a bishop or an abbot or something, somebody might be willing to buy or sell them to get them, or to get reward. A king or somebody that had authority to appoint someone might sell it. So they were very concerned about that. And third was they wanted to enforce clerical celibacy. The practice of clerical celibacy had been around for a while, but when I say clerical celibacy, I mean that priests should not be married and should not be having sexual relations with people, okay? So that was not always universally enforced, and it was simply accepted in many places that priests would have wives, or live-in wives, however you want to think of it. And this reform movement said that shouldn't be happening. Okay, they wanted to enforce that rule. In 1059, you had the establishment of the way popes are still elected. One of the issues for them was the papacy was an office that nobility fought over. Frankly, the German emperors controlled it for 80 years. Okay, and so in 1059, the Roman bishop and a group at this synod, a synod is a councilor meeting, they decided that the way they were going to choose popes was through this group called cardinals. Now, cardinals in this case were the priests and bishops and sometimes deacons who served in the vicinity of the Papal States in Rome, and often served to help the papal court. Okay, so they were clergy, and many of them were high-ranking clergy. So what they decided is this group should choose who the next popes should be when one pope died. And this is still the way popes are elected to this day. A pope has to get 2/3 or 66% of the vote today. That was added later. So early on, you only still would have had like 19 to 25 cardinals too. There's a lot more cardinals today too. That's another difference. And there were purposes for this. One, they wanted to stop the Roman nobles from controlling the papacy because they believe it corrupted it. And it probably did to some extent. The papacy was fought over by these different Roman noble factions within the city and the surrounding area. And they also wanted to keep the German emperor out. That was important to them. So that leads us to the next event. Notice how large the Holy Roman Empire, which does include the Papal States and other territories, becomes in northern Italy, okay? So this is why it becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire. An event known as the investiture controversy happened, and it had to do with this reform movement. And it ended up being a contest or fight in some cases between the papacy and the emperor, the German emperors, okay? So, investiture was the practice of giving someone their office, investing them with their office. And that's what you see happening in this picture. This king is investing this bishop with his sacred office of being a bishop, and he's giving him this object. This object was known as a crozier. It looks like a shepherd's staff, right? Well, bishops are shepherds, right? Spiritual shepherds are supposed to be. So, lay investiture is when the king, as a lay person, lay in this case meaning a person who is not ordained clergy. So you have the laity and you have the clergy, right? Kings are kings, but they were not clergy. But in this case, kings were investing or giving these offices to these clergy. All right? And the papal reformers came to see this as a bad thing. And you also had the issue of simony. So there were people who were willing, believe it or not, to bribe kings in order to get appointed to powerful church offices. And the papal reformers say we must have the freedom of the church must be free from interference by kings and emperors, because that causes corruption. That's the freedom of the church idea, okay? Well, the papal reform movement came to a head in the contest between the Pope Gregory the Seventh, and this is that's Henry here in this picture. So Pope Gregory the Seventh, who was a man who was very much in support of this reform movement, and the King of Germany, the King Henry IV. That's Henry in the picture here in this statue. Henry and a whole group of German bishops write a letter to the Pope, and they reject him, and say that they basically reject him as Pope, and say he doesn't have the authority to tell them what to do, because he's trying to enforce this rule about lay investiture. He's saying you should not be investing. I should be the one giving, or at least I should be approving of all your choices. Okay. And they say, we're not going to listen to you. So what he does in response to that is excommunicate them, which means to kick them out of the church, okay? So I'm going to excommunicate you. And that's it. Well, this led to a war in Germany. The whole group of German nobles decided, since the king's been excommunicated, we don't have to listen to what he says anymore, okay? And so a war starts in 1076 between a whole group of German nobles, dukes and counts and so forth, against King Henry IV. And now the Pope has a problem to deal with, right? And Henry's got a problem to deal with. Now this is supposed to be the Pope here. So in 1077, what happened here was Henry is losing this war with these nobles. So he's in a bad situation. In fact, he loses a battle and has to negotiate with the nobles. And what they tell him is that he has to reconcile with the Pope or he's out. Okay? So what he decides to do is make a big gamble he takes a big chance to go reconcile with the Pope. And I'll pick up on that event, Canossa 1077, Henry's Gamble, in the next video. Thanks.